on this computer. And you are now being recorded for posterity. We did basically, I decided as I was looking over the study, trying to recap Romans 3 and 4 is really kind of an impossibility. You can't really do a recap. At least maybe somebody else could. I can't. Without getting in depth, without really diving in to the text in a big way.
Can Jim hear it now?
So same with chapter 4. As I started getting into chapter 4, I realized you can't really summarize it. You have to kind of have to dig into it. And I know, I think all of us were there, or most of us were there when I taught chapter 4 a few weeks ago. And I found even new stuff to talk about as I was preparing this lesson earlier today. The big picture before we're going to go section by section. The big picture before I read the text. I think sometimes people have so much focus has been on chapter 3, and then picking up again in chapter 5. So much focus has been put on those chapters, kind of 4, because sometimes we treat it kind of as an afterthought, that it's not really central to Paul's argument, or that all Paul is really doing is using Abraham as an example of faith, which it's a lot more involved than that, a lot deeper than that. And what we'll see is that it's more central to the argument Paul is trying to make in the letter. And I think as I was studying this, chapter 4 is kind of like like a litmus test for how we understand Romans, in the sense of, if you view Romans in one certain way, chapter 4 is not going to be all that important. But if you view Romans in a slightly different way, chapter 4 becomes extremely important. So the chapter can be divided into 5 sections. Verses 1 through 8, believing the promise. Let me bear with me a second. Okay, technology. I mean, it's basically pretty quick, but it's where's Google Drive? Okay, I'm gonna pull up the handout because I posted on Facebook, but I realized I didn't send it. Not everybody's on Facebook, so I'm going to pull up. Let's decrease that. Okay, Google Docs. In just a moment, I'm going to share my screen so you can see the handout. There we go.
While you're doing that, can everybody mute unless you're talking? I think that'll stop it from switching screen to screen.
Okay, I can mute everybody because I have the power.
Mute us.
All right. Muted. I guess I don't have to announce it when I do it. All right, so you are all muted. Let's see, share screen. All right, everybody see that? Give me a thumbs up if you can see if you can see the document. Okay. So what you can see there is chapter 5 can be divided into 5 sections. 4, 1 through 8, believing the promise. 4, 9 through 15, not by circumcision, but not by the Torah. 16 and 17, the whole family according to the promise. 18 through 22, the God who gives life to the dead, and then 23 to 25, the meaning of Christian faith. Now, especially that title to that last section there gives us an indication that of how important chapter 4 is. And here's what happens is Paul is going to use the covenant between God and Abraham to make 3 points. First point concerns works, works of righteousness, whatever you want to call it. The second point about circumcision, and third point about the law. The question for Paul is not how does one become a Christian. Paul is not concerned with that. Paul is not concerned with how does somebody become a Christian. The question for Paul is, does Abraham's family include only Jews, or does it also include Gentiles? That's a big question for Paul. Paul's goal is not to outline the steps an individual has to take to be a Christian. And that's why I said chapter 4 is like a litmus test, or how you understand Romans will influence how you see the importance or prominence of chapter 4. If the way you understand Romans is simply, if you think Romans is just about how to become a Christian, you're not going to see chapter 4 as very different or very important. You're not going to see chapter 4 as very important, I'm going to say. However, if you understand Romans to be different, if you understand that Romans is kind of to answer the question, who belongs to the family of God, then chapter 4 becomes extremely important. I mean, I guess you could probably guess which I choose. I don't think Romans is about how the steps an individual takes to become a Christian. By show of hands, who in here has heard of something called the Romans Road? Anybody heard of the Romans Road? Well, you didn't grow up where I'm from, obviously. Out in Rowan County, the Romans Road was basically is this way of evangelizing where certain verses of Romans, all from Romans, were kind of lifted out of the text, and it was kind of the plan of salvation, what to do to be saved. And so the reading, that leads to a reading of Romans where it's simply about what it means to become a Christian. How do you become a Christian? Which is a really individualistic reading of Romans. And it's also really doesn't take into account the cultural or historical background of the letter, which means if you don't take that into account, you really don't understand the letter. We can become pretty egotistical sometimes when it comes to the text. Here's the thing. Paul is not talking, really, when Paul wrote this letter, he wasn't thinking about me and you. He was not thinking about 21st century American Christians. So it helps us to think, to kind of try to dig in to see what Paul was thinking about, kind of where he was coming from. And Paul's concern was not how does one become a Christian. Paul's concern was who is allowed access into the family of God? Who gets to claim to be part of God's family? Who belongs? And it prompts an additional question. On what basis does Abraham's family include Gentiles? If Gentiles are included, how does that happen? All right, so there's a little background here going back to Genesis. And really the heart of that story is Genesis 12 through 17. We're only going to read a couple of verses, one from a verse from chapter 12 and the 2 verses from chapter 15. In chapter 12 is when God calls Abram. Abram's a Gentile, a pagan from Ur the Chaldeans, and of course, when Abram was called, there were no Jews, there were no people of God, but Genesis 12:3 says, "I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse." And here's the important part. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Notice that emphasis, all the families. And I can share that screen again. And emphasis there is mine under Genesis 12:3. All the families of the earth shall be blessed. Not just the Jewish people. So God was not just talking about, he doesn't say through you, one family will be blessed. All the families. In the second little passage that's important for us for our lesson tonight is Genesis 15:5-6. God brought Abram outside and said, look towards heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. Then he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. So, circumcision doesn't happen until chapter 17. So in chapter 15, Abraham believed God's promises, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, meaning God considered Abraham righteous based on Abraham's trust in God's promises. This was before circumcision, so what that means is there's not a connection between God reckoning righteousness to Abraham to circumcision. That they're not connected. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. All right, before we transition into the first section, any questions? Raise your hand if you got a question. I'll unmute you. I'm looking at you, Pam. No questions yet? Okay. All right, so verses 1-8 read as follows. What then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. But to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. So also David speaks of the blessedness of those to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not reckon sin. So there are several New Testament scholars who think that verse 1 is better understood as saying, what then shall we say? Have we found Abraham to be our forefather according to the flesh? Meaning, and really the point there being, who can count Abraham as their forefather? Who can truly say I'm part of the family of Abraham? Is it only an ethnic lineage? Is it only about being kind of ethnically being part of the Jewish people? Is it connected to circumcision and Torah obedience? Or is it something broader and bigger? According to N.T. Wright, the commentary I'm using, it makes much more sense as an introduction to what Paul is actually saying in chapter 4, for Paul to ask that question, have we found Abraham to be our forefather according to the flesh? That makes more sense for chapter 4, where the focus is the scope and nature of Abraham's family, and not about justification by faith, but about, again, as I mentioned, who belongs to Abraham. All right, Paul's effort here, and again, as we go through, what we're going to see is the distinction made between kind of why was Abraham righteous? Was it something he did, or was it works, or was it faith? Paul is not trying to attack, it's not primarily to attack works-based salvation. Paul is arguing that inclusion of in the family of God is not based on ethnicity, since the original covenant with Abraham was not based on ethnicity. There was no Jewish ethnicity when Abraham was called by God. In other words, in any claim that inclusion in God's family is based on the Jews possessing the Torah, that's not supported by God's covenant with Abraham. Because guess what did not exist when God made his covenant with Abraham and reckoned him righteous? The Torah did not exist. So that reckoning as righteous is not done through Torah. All right. It is the promise that we read in Genesis 15 that Abraham believes, and it is his faith or trust in God that God reckons or credits to Abraham as righteousness. Another way we can understand this is God counted Abraham's faith as constituting covenant membership. Abraham's trust in God's promise gave him basically access or entry into this covenant. And as we go through, Paul uses an employment wage earning metaphor for justification. And that's become, it's the only time Paul uses this image of wages and employment to talk about justification. Paul makes a contrast between someone who earns a wage through works and one who doesn't work but trusts God for justification and salvation. So, for example, if you're working, if you have a job, and then you get a paycheck, is that a gift? Is your paycheck a gift? No, paycheck is not a gift. It's earned. A paycheck is what is due to you. You're entitled to your pay. And that's what Paul is saying here. If salvation is earned through our works, then it becomes something we're entitled to. And it actually turns out we're making a demand on God. Pay me what you owe me. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to have that attitude to God. So salvation is not a result of works as if it's something we earn like a paycheck. Salvation is a pure gift from God. And so, you see, that's the way Paul is disconnecting salvation from works. Does that make sense? You can't earn it. All right. N.T. Wright says, kind of echoing what I just said, God's declaration of justification is a matter of grace, and it has to do with God's justifying the ungodly. All right. But what we've seen, that whole stretch from the second half of chapter 1 through chapter 2, the first half of chapter 3, is that everybody's ungodly. Right? Everybody's a sinner. And so it's good news that God justifies the ungodly, because if God only justified the godly, there'd be nobody to justify. The godly are already justified. They don't need justification. God justifies the ungodly because that's all there is. All right. The metaphor, though, is not an either or. Paul does not claim that those who trust God don't have works. It's about how we are actually justified, not by our power, but by God's grace. I was thinking about this earlier today. This fits very nicely with Jesus' image of trees that bear fruit. A tree bears fruit. He talks about good works as basically bearing fruit. Good works are the fruit that we bear. But we don't plant ourselves. Like in that metaphor, we are planted by God, and God gives growth, and God gives the nourishment for us to grow. And as a result of being planted, we bear fruit. So justification, being made righteous, being reckoned as righteous by God, is like being planted. We're not planted because we bear fruit. We are planted and then we bear fruit. Does that make sense? We are justified, made righteous by God, and then we bear the fruit of good works. All right. So Paul's just putting things in order here for us. And another quote from N.T. Wright, Paul is wrestling not with the question of Abraham's faith. So the focus for Paul is not Abraham's faith, but with the question of God's character and identity. That's Paul's focus. Who is this God? How do we become part of God's people? And then this little section, Paul finishes off by quoting Psalm 32:2, one of David's Psalms. David's an interesting example here. Given if you look at any kind of children's Bible or a number of children's Bibles or children's Bible stories, you could probably, if you searched Google, you could probably find a book somewhere that would talk about heroes of the Old Testament. Which the more you know the Old Testament, the more of a joke that becomes. Because the people of the Old Testament were deeply, deeply flawed. Which is good, but they did some not very admirable things. And you can go back to Noah. He was pretty good before the flood, but after the flood, it kind of all fell apart. You can go up through Moses. Moses killed somebody and took off. And also Moses, think about how Moses responded to God's initial call. Can't you call somebody else? Don't you know I have a speech impediment? And then somebody like David. Well, obviously David had the whole Bathsheba Uriah thing. It's not exactly top-notch moral behavior. So even David is a complicated character here. But then again, it's not about, now that Paul's going to address this later in the letter, that doesn't mean we just have free reign to do whatever we want to do, to go sinning and, being destructive and hateful and immoral and whatever. We are called to bear fruit. We are called to serve Jesus, serve other people. But if we're justified by God, if we trust in God's promises, what motivates us is not idolatry or self-interest or lust or anger or whatever. What motivates us is the Spirit of God within us and a desire to please God and to serve others. Okay. Continuing on, verse 9 through 15. Paul says, is this blessedness then pronounced only on the circumcised or also on the uncircumcised? We say, faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised, and to thus have righteousness reckoned to them, and likewise the ancestor of the circumcised, who were not only circumcised, but who also follow the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised. Now, I wonder if Paul provoked among recently circumcised Jewish Christians any kind of buyer's remorse. If I had recently been circumcised and then along comes Paul and tells me I don't have to be circumcised, that might not sit very well with me. I think I would have a vested interest in talking, and believing circumcision was of some importance. But either way, Paul continues about circumcision. The primary issue is about who belongs in the family of God. Paul gets to the heart of the matter in verse 9. Are the people who are blessed only the circumcised or also the uncircumcised? When we go back to that verse from chapter 12 that said, through Abraham or in Abraham, how many of the families of earth will be blessed? All of them. All families on earth will be blessed, circumcised or uncircumcised. In order to answer the question about who belongs to God's family, Paul goes back to Abraham and asks us to consider the order of how things went down in Genesis 15 through 17. God reckoned Abraham as righteous back in chapter 12. God reckoned Abraham as righteous before circumcision. It's helpful to note, as Paul says, that circumcision is a sign of an already established covenant, not the entry point into that covenant. The entry point, the thing that's reckoned as righteousness, is trust in God's covenant faithfulness. Now, again, it might seem I'm being really repetitive here, but Paul is saying all this in a very, kind of small space, in a very kind of tight little section here. And the issue is that righteousness was reckoned to Abraham before he was circumcised. And so Paul makes a very bold, shocking claim in verse 11. He says, Abraham received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith. Here's the claim. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised. Now, this is where that's your cue to gasp. That Abraham is the father of the uncircumcised. I'm sure there would have been Jewish Christians who heard this claim and were absolutely infuriated by what Paul is saying here. Because Paul is saying that Abraham, who is considered to be the father of the Jewish faith, like the first patriarch, Paul is saying that Abraham is not just the father, not only the father of the Jews, but primarily, first of all, the father of the uncircumcised, the father of the Gentiles. Because Abraham believed, trusted in God, and that trust was reckoned as righteousness before circumcision. So righteousness comes before circumcision. So Abraham is the father of the uncircumcised. It's no wonder that Paul was not popular with Jewish leadership, because this is incendiary stuff in the first century. Okay, Pam. You used the raised hand feature.
Hey.
Yeah.
So are you saying that Abraham was what?
Mute yours and speak through mine.
It is me. Oh. Okay. Wrong thing.
Still not muted.
I'll mute you. All right. There you go. You have to
Okay.
go to. You have to.
So are you saying that Abraham was or was not circumcised?
He eventually was, but the covenant was established before he was circumcised.
Okay. All right.
God called him. Abraham trusted God. God reckoned that to him as righteousness
Mhm.
before circumcision. Because remember that we talked about this before, that in the first century there were Jewish Christians who said that in order to become a Christian, you first have to become a Jew. And in order to become a Jew, you have to be circumcised.
Right.
And then you would be a Christian. And Paul says, looking back to Abraham, that righteousness came before circumcision. Circumcision is just a sign of the covenant. Okay. Paul argues that Abraham is the father of all those who follow the example of faith, regardless of whether or not they're circumcised. So he's not saying that Jews are not part of the family of Abraham. He's just saying that the Jews can't keep the Gentiles from being part of that same family based on circumcision. Okay. Verse 13 is another crucial point. When God called Abraham and established the covenant, God did not give the Torah or the law to Abraham. The starting point was not law obedience. The starting point was not obedience to the law. The starting point was covenant faithfulness. So it didn't say Abraham did everything God commanded and it was reckoned as righteousness. It said Abraham trusted, believed God, and it was reckoned as righteousness. Verse 15 restates that what a point we've made before. Verse 15 says, "For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation." And I realized I stopped reading. I didn't read 13 and 14, 15. So here we go. This is chapter 4, verses 13 through 15. "For the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith." The point I just made, God did not give Abraham the Torah. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. Because if it's a law, that means the covenant God made with Abraham and Abraham's faith, they don't matter because that wasn't done under the auspices of the law. That was covenant and faithfulness. And here's verse 15. "For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation." And that's the point I've made several times. The law does not reveal the righteousness of God. The law reveals human sinfulness. It is the gospel that reveals God's righteousness, not the law. Okay, so continuing on into verse 16 and 17, Paul says, "For this reason it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham, for he is the father of all of us. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. In the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist." So Paul is going back even further than Abraham here, taking us all the way back to the start of Genesis, that in Genesis 1, God calls forth into existence things that do not exist, the Creator God. But then we also hook into Abraham's story with the miraculous birth of Isaac, that Abraham and Sarah should not have been able to have a child, but God calls forth things that do not exist into existence, like Isaac. And so he's talking about God, the Creator God, but he's going to connect that really to resurrection. That the same God that created the heavens and the earth, the same God that gave Isaac to Abraham and Sarah, is the same God who raised Jesus from the dead, creating life where there was no life. But here in these two little verses 16 and 17, Paul completes the line of questioning he began in verse 1, where he said, he was talking about basically who belongs to the family of God, who can claim Abraham as an ancestor. And in the first part of verse 16, he says, "For this reason it depends on faith." It doesn't depend on ethnicity. Justification is not based on belonging to a specific people. It's not achieved through law obedience. It's not accomplished by anything that we can do. Justification depends on faith. Now here's the twist, because you might be thinking I'm talking about your faith. Here's where we combine what Paul argued in chapter 3 with chapter 4. Justification does not depend on our faith, but on the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Remember, our justification is a gift. It is a pure gift. We can't earn it. It is given to us through the faithfulness of Jesus. This is an astounding claim of radical grace. This is radical grace because I think so many of us are not used to pure grace. People just aren't used. we're so used to having strings attached or feeling some sense of like, I need to earn this, or we don't like receiving things necessarily that we feel like we don't deserve. I think there's some skepticism that comes up for a lot of us. And to just say it's given to us without us having to do anything. And okay, we might be able to accept it for ourselves because we might be thinking, well, I mean, I've sinned and all, but I'm a pretty good person. But if we think about, and I can pull a Paul trick here on you. Think about somebody in your life who is just like either mean or dishonest or untrustworthy, or somebody you've met in your life that's just a jerk. Does everybody have somebody? Don't name, well, you're all muted. I mean, you can name names, but don't name names. Yeah, if you all got somebody.
I think Pam would be me.
Pam said, just go to the living room. If you all got somebody in mind, God's grace is just as freely abundant for them as it is for you. And you can even think about the worst person you could think of. Same deal. Nobody is ever beyond the reach of God's invitation of grace. That's hard for us to put our heads around when we think about somebody like, say, Hitler. You got a question, Pam? Are you going to use your mic and cause all kind of audio problems, or are you going to use Dick's mic?
Okay.
All right, Pam.
So we're all justified, but it's what we do with that justification. I mean, you were just saying something about Hitler or someone else who has done horrific things, a serial killer or something.
Yeah, I don't want to make the claim that we're all justified, that everybody is just kind of justified.
Right.
We all have the opportunity to receive the gift of justification.
Right. And
Because,
so then from there comes what we do with it.
Yes, there comes a response, which, first time I say this tonight, you have to wait to chapter 12.
Oh, no. It wouldn't be a Bible study if you didn't say.
Wouldn't be a study if I didn't say that. Okay, good question.
Thank you.
All right. Since justification depends on the faithfulness of Jesus Christ and is given to us as a pure gift, this means that we are incorporated into God's family through God's covenant faithfulness and our willingness to receive, not through circumcision, not through law obedience, not through moral achievement, not even through our own faith in God. It is through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. It is our faith that allows us to receive it, to receive that gift. Our faith doesn't enable the gift. Our faith is not that powerful. Our faith does not enable salvation. Salvation is accomplished through Jesus Christ and Jesus alone. Our faith allows us to receive that gift and then live into a new reality of being redeemed and saved. All right, so then we get to verses 18 through 22. Where am I? There we go. Hoping against hope, he believed that he would become the father of many nations. According to what was said, so numerous shall your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Therefore, his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Abraham's faith was not some general religious belief or the awareness of some mysterious other. Abraham's faith was trust in specific promises given by a specific God. So Abraham believed not just in any God or in divinity. Abraham believed in this particular God that made a covenant with him. And here in this, Paul is beginning to move. He's starting to transition into kind of the next section. This first section is really about unity between believing Jews and believing Gentiles. That's really kind of what this first section is about of Romans. Paul trying to basically say it's level the playing field, so to speak. Are you raising your hand, Pam? No, I can't. No, Pam just went away. She went somewhere. There she is. Paul is beginning to widen the horizon and transition to another section to speak more directly of the true God, the nature of faith in the true God, and the way in which his faith is the hallmark of genuine humanness as opposed to the corrupt variety of humanness, which Paul has already argued and already established that kind of corruption is universal. And in verses 20 through 21, when he describes Abraham's resolute faith, his faith did not waver when he considered all like that. He was 100 and God said, you're going to have a kid. And Sarah's 90 something and she's going to have a kid. Abraham still believed and kept his trust firmly in God. Paul is contrasting that with the human condition described in chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, where we see the results of people engaged in idolatry. That idolatry leads to all manner of immorality. And this is from N.T. Wright, the commentary I'm using. Paul did not think that Abraham's faith was meritorious, meaning that Abraham's faith was, that it was Abraham's faith that kind of accomplished the covenant. God does that. In other words, Paul didn't think Abraham's faith was something to boast about. Now, Paul's already said we have no grounds for boasting. We don't boast. Rather, it was Abraham's response to grace, the grace that had called him in the first place and that now addressed him with life-giving promises. So, again, it's not our power that saves us, and it's not about our faith that is so great. It's that phrase, it's almost a cliche, it's not our great faith in God, but our faith in a great God. So it's God that does this, and we are grateful, humble recipients. All right, then the last 3 verses of this chapter with the heading, The Meaning of Christian Faith, which seems pretty daunting to talk about the meaning of Christian faith in 3 verses, but here we are. Now, the words, it was reckoned to him, were written not for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was handed over to death for our trespasses and was raised for our justification. Okay, so Paul hasn't used us, our language, and really hasn't addressed the Roman Christians audience or addressed us by extension since chapter 1, verses 5 through 15. Starting really in 1:16 through just now, it's been Paul's extended back and forth with this interlocutor. And so Paul now shifts away from that and talks to us again. He addresses us. For Paul, and this is something that doesn't show up as forcefully in Romans as it does say in 1 Corinthians 15, but for Paul, the center of the Christian faith is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Without the resurrection of Jesus, there is no Christianity. There is no Christian faith. There is no salvation. There is no redemption. If there is no resurrection, Jesus was simply a martyr. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians, we are most of all to be pitied. Basically because we're fools. If there is no resurrection, this is pointless. And we note in verse 24 here It will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. So it's us who believe in God who raised Jesus from the dead. And that supports our understanding that the important thing is the faith of Jesus Christ, the faithfulness of Jesus to God the Father. We emulate that. We follow Jesus by having faith in God. It's not about our faith in Jesus. Remember, we talked about that last week. Faith of, that it's actually the faith of Jesus, not our faith in Jesus. It's the faith of Jesus in God that led him to the cross, trusting in God's promise, trusting in the resurrection. And it's our faith in God, basically imitating Jesus. And it's the faith of Jesus, the faith of Jesus in God, faith in God, that made the crucifixion and resurrection possible. That is our salvation. This is from Wright, N.T. Wright. Confessing that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead means sharing the faith of Abraham in God. And that faith, as Paul has now argued, is the one and only badge of membership in Abraham's family. So, who is part of Abraham's family? Anyone who puts their trust in God. And how does that happen? Through sharing the faith of Abraham, trusting in God's promise, and that's made possible through the faith of Jesus in God, crucifixion and resurrection. Like Abraham, our trust in God's faithfulness is reckoned to us as righteousness. God's covenant faithfulness, God's righteousness is revealed in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our salvation, our redemption, our justification is accomplished not by our faith, but by the faithfulness of Jesus, who died on the cross and was raised from the dead for us and for our salvation, indeed for the redemption of all creation. And Paul here is alluding to Isaiah 53, the suffering servant who was vindicated by God. This is from Wright, N.T. Wright. Jesus' life and death were the true faithfulness for which God had created Israel in the first place. Thus, if faithful Jesus is demonstrated to be the Messiah by the resurrection also declares in principle that all those who belong to Jesus, all those who respond in faith to God's faithfulness revealed in him, in Jesus, are themselves part of the true covenant family promised to Abraham. So it's not about circumcision. It's about faith. The end of chapter 4 closes the first section of Romans and propels us into the rest of the letter. That's chapter 4. Good. Any questions? Now, Bob, I'll give you about 4 days before you have a question for me.
Can you be a Christian and not be baptized?
Bob's trying to get me in trouble. Baptism is the way we as Methodists understand baptism is not salvation. Baptism is incorporation into the body of Christ and a public declaration of God's grace that's been at work in our lives since birth. So it's basically incorporation into, it's a covenant between the person being baptized or their family and the church, the body of Christ. So baptism is not salvation. So yes, you can be a Christian without baptism, but to belong to the family of God, the church, the body of Christ, in covenant, you have to be baptized.
So baptism isn't like circumcision to Jews.
No, it's also a lot easier and not nearly as messy.
Well, the meaning of it, you have to be circumcised to be a Jew. Do you have to be baptized to be a Christian?
No. No.
Okay.
And I don't know how many people outside of our church watch this Bible study, but if you're mad at me about that, Too bad. I've just spent I just spent an hour saying that there's nothing we can do to earn salvation. There's nothing we have to do. There's no action, no work. That includes baptism. That baptism is a work. It's a thing we do. Vitally important. It's a sign of God's grace. It's a covenant that's established between the person being baptized and the church and God. But salvation is different, something different. Good question, though. Okay, so next week this is the second time moving, and I've done better. Like it was easier to teach second go around, but I'm not going to repeat every lesson. So next week we'll get into chapter 5, and we'll see how long, because next week, the next few weeks, we'll move from Abraham to Adam, which is a very different conversation. And so I hope this recorded. I hope it works. If it doesn't work, all those Facebook Live folks are just out of luck. And I will work on this week to see if I can get it get it working. All right. Thanks for joining me this evening. And hopefully next week we'll be able to Zoom and then connect to Facebook Live. So
Well, thanks for all you and Tony Ruth are doing with all this communication and keeping us in touch.
it's really important right now. I mean, we have to be isolated physically, but there's no reason we can't connect with one another. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording in 3, 2, 1.